Who knew horror could be so beautiful?
I never thought I would find myself in a school lockdown, let alone next to the school shooter. But there I was, crouched behind a desk, trying to remain as still and quiet as possible. It had started like any other day. I had arrived at school early, hoping to get some extra studying done before my classes started. But before I knew it, the loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing that we were under a lockdown. My heart had started racing as I followed my teacher's instructions, locking the door and turning off the lights. We all huddled in the corner of the room, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. At first, everything was quiet. But then I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, growing louder and more frantic by the second. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized that someone was trying to get into our classroom. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a figure stumbled in. I could see the outline of a gun in his hand, and my heart dropped. This was it. We were going to die. The shooter scanned the room, his eyes darting from student to student. I tried to make myself as invisible as possible, hoping that he wouldn't notice me. But then, his eyes fell on me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as he took a step closer, his gun still pointed at me. "Stand up," he said, his voice low and menacing. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. Should I comply with his orders or try to run? Before I could make a decision, he took another step closer. "I said stand up," he repeated, his voice growing more impatient. Slowly, I stood up, feeling as if my legs were made of lead. I could feel my classmates' eyes on me, their fear and panic palpable. The shooter gestured for me to come closer, and I took a hesitant step forward. He put his gun to my head, and I could feel the cold metal pressing against my skin. "I'm going to let you go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But you have to promise me that you won't tell anyone about this. You won't tell the police or your parents or anyone." I nodded, too scared to speak. The shooter let me go, and I stumbled back to my seat, my heart racing. For what felt like hours, we sat there in silence, listening to the sounds of chaos outside. I could hear shouting, running footsteps, and the sound of doors being slammed shut. My mind raced with questions. What was happening outside? Were the police coming to rescue us? As the minutes ticked by, the shooter became increasingly agitated. He paced back and forth, muttering to himself and occasionally glancing over at me. I could feel his eyes on me, and I knew that I was still in danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard a voice over the loudspeaker. "Attention all students and faculty," the voice said. "Police have now found out what classroom the gunman is in, and we will capture him very soon. He will not make it out without being held accountable. Run outside fast as you can." The shooter turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "Remember your promise," he said, before turning and fleeing the room. I stumbled out of the classroom, feeling as if I had just woken up from a nightmare. Outside, the school was in a state of chaos. There were police officers everywhere, some holding weapons and shouting orders. Other students were crying or hugging each other, clearly traumatized by what had just happened. In the aftermath of the lockdown, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The sense of safety and security that I had once felt was gone, replaced by a constant feeling of anxiety and fear. I couldn't shake the memory of the shooter's gun against my head, or the fear in his eyes as he fled the room. The news of what had happened soon spread, and our small town was plunged into a state of mourning. We learned that the shooter had been a former student at our school, and that he had been struggling with mental health issues for years. I couldn't help but feel angry and confused. How had we let this happen? How had someone who was clearly struggling been able to obtain a gun and carry out such a heinous act? As the weeks and months passed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. I attended therapy sessions and talked to my friends and family about my experience. I tried to find solace in the fact that we had all survived, but the memory of the lockdown continued to haunt me. Years have passed since that day, and while I've tried to move on, the memory of the lockdown and the shooter's gun against my head still lingers. I think about it often, especially when I hear about school shootings happening elsewhere in the world. I know that I'm lucky to have survived, but I can't help but wonder what could have been done differently to prevent the shooting from happening in the first place. It's a question that will likely never be fully answered, but one that I can't help but ask myself. In the end, I've learned that life is precious and that we should never take our safety for granted. We should all work to create a world where no one feels the need to carry out such violent acts, and where every child feels safe in their school.
Like, subscribe, and smash the bell for more beautiful horror.